Thank you so much, Kathleen, for joining me this evening to talk about your book, Aesthetics in Grief and Mourning. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you, so thank you. I wondered if we might start by, if I could just ask you really what it was that drew you to write a book about grief and mourning. What is it about grief in particular that you think is philosophically interesting?
Well, what drew me to write about it was experiencing it and noticing how many of the interactions I had with other people involved aesthetics. I think that probably because I had heard Arthur Danto talk about beauty and grief along the way of discussing beauty in a talk many years ago, that I might have been especially primed, I guess, to think about aesthetics in this connection. But one of the things that I think is philosophically interesting about grief is that even though philosophy often talks about emotions, it doesn't often talk about emotions that are long term or more complicated emotional processes. I mean, some people would even debate whether grief is an emotion at all, just because there are so many different emotions that grieving people experience while they're in a state of grief and while they're mourning. So I thought that was philosophically interesting. But also, I think it is interesting that aesthetics, which is sometimes marginalized as people think about the big questions, is actually really central to one of the most major and problematic sides of life. So that's another reason that I wanted to write about this.
Thank you. I mean, one of the chapters in your book gives a phenomenological account of grief, and you talk about different characteristics of grief and how they might manifest. And a common feature of a lot of accounts of grief is this feeling of rupture, of one's whole world being transformed. And you use Thomas Attig's term in the book, this idea of the grief process involving the need to relearn the world because so much has changed. I wonder if you'd like to talk about that a bit.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that's very odd about grieving is that in one sense, you're interacting with probably a lot of the same people that you interacted with before, and their world seems to be operating as it has been to a large extent. And yet it seems that you're operating in this same world in a completely different way. One of the oddities, and this is something that Denise Riley, who is both a poet and a philosopher, has written about, is that often you feel kind of out of the temporal flow of life. Everybody else, I mean, other people who are grieving, of course, accepted, but many of the other people that you see around you are operating in this kind of flow of time that you used to be part of too, but suddenly you're not. And it doesn't seem that any project that involves the future has a lot of meaning in these circumstances. It challenges one's ability to find meaning in one's living in the world at all, because it's such a profound loss to encounter the world without a person that you used to see as really very central to your experience of it. And given that, I think it's almost inevitable that you feel a certain kind of detachment or distance from other people, and actually at a time when you very much need other people. I mean, the support of others is pretty vital, really, in experience all the time, but while grieving, especially when you often feel that you're not at your best or really capable of thinking rationally for very long at a time. So that, I think, is a very strange aspect of it. And just the fact that you tend to look around and kind of expect to see the person, even though you know that the person is dead, means that you're often operating with a kind of double think going on that isn't really possible to put together. So the need for other people to kind of help you along the way in this set of circumstances, I think, is pretty profound. All of this, I think, philosophically is fascinating because grief is not a completely bizarre, I mean, it is a bizarre experience, but it's not one that only a few people have. Almost everyone at one time or another experiences grief, and often very profound grief. And the fact that it seems to involve a whole way of experiencing the world that is anomalous by comparison with the rest of life struck me as really a pretty fascinating topic.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think that's exactly why grief is so interesting. And I mean, you talked about this this sort of feeling of being out of step, I guess, with the rest of the world in some way. And that is a particularly challenging aspect of grief, I think. I I recall from my own experiences when someone close to me died, having this sort of overwhelming sense of almost wanting to kind of run out into the street and you know, grab people and shout and say, you know, do you realize what's happened here? You know, how can you just walk down the street when this earth-shattering event has taken place? But then equally at the same time, when I did engage in conversation with people, being very frustrated because how could they possibly understand what it was that I was going through? And so there's this sort of desire for connection, but also this great discomfort or almost rejection of connection as well, because it can't give you what it is that you're searching for.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's also a situation in which, I mean, on the one hand you realize that they aren't experiencing the same thing, partly you want to, I mean, assuming that you're grieving someone that you love and you know, want the world to continue to recognize, you really want to draw the world's attention to the loss. At the same time, you know that the world is operating as it usually does, and that there's no possible way that you're going to get the whole world to stop. In fact, a lot of times I think when grieving, you don't really want to play the world's game. I mean, you don't want to go along with it, partly out of a sense of loyalty to the deceased, because it seems a little bit inappropriate or like you're abandoning the person to operate as though things haven't changed as drastically as you feel that they have. And that, I think, really makes it a complicated and extended process to somehow make peace with feeling a kind of commitment and express your loyalty and love of the deceased, while at the same time re-engaging with a world that operates in a way without any recognition of loss. I think it's really difficult in contexts of societies in which there isn't a lot of social place to acknowledge grief. You mentioned everyone feeling rather uncomfortable interacting with someone who is grieving. And I think part of it is that grief isn't something that's really assimilated into a socially acceptable form of acknowledgement. So, I mean, admittedly, people often feel that they should send a sympathy card or maybe flowers to someone who is grieving a major loss in their life. But beyond that kind of immediate response, there isn't much of a way that is comfortable to socially acknowledge the fact. We don't wear mourning clothes anymore. It isn't something that people feel comfortable bringing up. And I think a lot of people even feel, I think usually not quite appropriately, that to bring up the loss is going to upset someone who's grieving. Um, I think, in fact, for many people who are grieving, it's a relief to make it socially acknowledged. But I think often people, out of concern for the well being of someone grieving, think that bringing it up is going to make their suffering greater.
Yeah. And I think there's often a feeling, which again comes across in a lot of writing about people's experience of grief, that you're really confronted by the limits of language, really, when it comes to trying to express what it is that you are experiencing, which is a particularly difficult aspect of grief, I think.
I agree with that. I mean, I think the fact that one can't assume that other people share metaphysical beliefs about the dead and their status probably aggravates it. But in any case, I think it is very difficult to either express quite how you feel if you're a person grieving, or to know quite what to say that is acknowledging the other person's loss, but doing any good. In fact, I think, fumbling gestures can in fact do people a fair amount of good, but it's difficult to really convince yourself of that if you're someone who wants to be supportive in these contexts. And this is one of the reasons that I think aesthetic activities and gestures and behaviors are so valuable, because in context of aesthetics, which includes not just formally art and engagement with art, but art-like behaviors and appreciation of aspects of the world around one and arrangements of things, those are a kind of aspect of our lives that we don't expect people to be in specific lock sync in how they respond. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's an arena of life in which people's various responses are part of what makes aesthetics valuable in itself. So if I respond to an artwork in one way and someone else mentions, but I was noticing this, it enriches both of our experience and brings us together at the same time.
Mm. I mean, one of the particularly interesting things about the book, I think, is the way that you spotlight really just the huge range of aesthetic activities and practices and gestures, as you say, that really come into play in these sorts of circumstances of grief and mourning. I wondered if you'd like to talk a bit more about what it is you mean by the aesthetic in this context.
Well, it's a very capacious term, and it's been used in different ways at different times in history. And I mean it in an extremely broad sense. So obviously, some kinds of activities and contexts for appreciation, such as the arts in a formal sense, but also creative activities that people engage in, memorial gestures that people make, such as making a home altar or arranging things to kind of focus on, say, a picture of the deceased in one's home, or doing things that are memorializing that in one way or another gesture toward the world to notice. I know a friend who had a park bench installed in her sister's favorite park after her sister died. And it has a little plaque on it. And it's not that everyone who uses the park bench is probably going to notice it, but at least it makes a gesture of bringing the deceased into the social world where there's a recognition of someone who has died. I'd call that aesthetic too. And in general, appreciation of nature or a lot of tangible things around us, that can be aesthetic. So I think it is a huge range of things. The fact that most people have something in the way of a funeral commemoration certainly involves an aesthetic aspect to things, if only because there's a kind of dramatic structure to most rituals. So I would see that as aesthetic too, and for that matter, even etiquette that people engage in. So the sending of sympathy cards or flowers that I mentioned before, that's certainly a kind of aesthetic gesture of support. And in that case, I think that it draws attention to the fact that many ways that we engage with things aesthetically are in contrast to having a definite, specific message that you want to verbalize with just these words. And that creates much more of an opportunity to convey a kind of feeling response without getting everybody on the same page about exactly what's happening.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned the example of a bench, a memorial bench for someone who's died, and I think there's also something really powerful about the idea that even if a member of the public sitting on the bench doesn't read the plaque at all, there's something comforting about them enjoying a view that the deceased person once enjoyed. There's that, I don't know, there's something meaningful about that kind of commonality of experience, that there's something about that continues after the death. And it's those sort of kind of things really that are maybe a bit more difficult to articulate that I thought were really beautifully expressed in your book. And I found it, I found it very helpful actually to think about some of these things in relation to my own experiences. I mean, you draw on some of your own personal experiences in the book, and some of them you talk about in some detail. I wondered why you felt it was important to do that when writing this book, and whether there are any particular challenges or benefits that you found from incorporating that into the text.
Well, I think that in philosophical discussion, there is a kind of problem in incorporating personal material. Not that all experiences can omit personal detail, but because philosophy often is interested in patterns that are widespread, if not universal, then it may seem that an individual's experience with its quirks is something that ought to be brought in without the quirks. And in fact, I think the quirks are a lot of what aesthetic experiences of every sort involve. So that makes it, sort of theoretically problematic. But given the topic, one of the things that I think is most salient about grief is it isn't a matter of just kind of fitting into the pattern, like, oh, well, now I'm grieving and I'm doing this and I'm going through these stages. I don't think that's the experience of anybody actually having the experience of grief. So one reason to bring in personal experience was to speak with at least the authority of someone who has had experiences of grief, but also experiences of some of the things that don't seem to fit the pattern or more abstract descriptions of what's going on. Grief isn't abstract at all. That's one of the things that's most shocking about it. And I think sometimes in philosophical discussion, because the strangeness of what one is thinking tends to get expressed in terms of what one believes or what one thinks, the sort of immediacy of it, even the sensory impact of grief is often ignored. So I think bringing in personal experience gave a little bit of, at least provided an example of situations in which the sensory shock and also the sensory strangeness of the experience gets reflected.
And one of the particularly beautiful passages in the book, I think, is when you talk about wearing your late husband's gloves and that being like a sort of surrogate for holding hands, which is such a lovely image and really really brings alive, I think, a lot of the things that you're trying to talk about. So I think it definitely works very well in this book. I think one of the sort of challenges, I think, that seems to be about thinking and writing about grief is that so much of it is so particular to that particular individual and that particular relationship that the bereaved has had to that person. And so there's something that about that might make one resistant to generalizing about the grief experience. And yet there are these commonalities which you bring out in your book. And there's also some great comfort to be had in the in a lot of the aesthetic rituals and practices that you talk about. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that sort of tension.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why when one reads grief memoirs, I mean, often I have a sense that the author is trying to describe something that the author expects other people to recognize in a certain way while being faithful to the particularity of that person's own experience. And I guess in some ways, this is maybe not unlike interpreting literature in general. Obviously, when someone is writing about maybe a fictional character or in memoir case about themselves, what really makes the story come alive is the fact that it's a particular person having concrete, actual experiences where there's a lot that's unpredictable. And I think that that is a description that applies very nicely to what connection a reader might have to that account. And I think that's very true in grief as well. And yet there is a sense in which someone writing about it is holding their own experience up as something of an example. And I think it would be strange if anyone doing that really thought, like, well, this sequence of strange experiences I've had is going to be exactly like the sequence of strange experiences someone else has. But I think that there's still a sense of some commonality just in being in this really altered state of relating to the world that is not at all predictable. I mean, that's what people often have in common. So I think, a way of dealing with the tension is to be as concrete as possible and not maybe to guess too much in advance what people are going to find familiar and what they won't.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we could turn now to some of the sort of specific ways that you've written about where aesthetic activities or practices can help people to heal following great loss, can help people navigate this process of needing to relearn the world. So one of the ideas in the book, which I find particularly interesting, is this idea of the companion artwork. I wondered if you could talk about that a little, please.
Sure. Actually, the idea of companion stories comes from Arthur Frank, who wrote about the kinds of stories that people develop in thinking about their own relationship to a serious illness. And so he talks in his book, The Wounded Storyteller, about different kinds of stories that people tell and the value that it has for them navigating that experience. And many people have also applied what he has to say to experiences of trying to make sense of loss and grief. But his notion of the companion artwork, the companion story, was that particular stories that others tell become very meaningful to people facing serious illness. So he talks, for instance, about a little boy who was really focused on Toy Story, the movie, and the character Buzz Lightyear. And he could relate to Buzz Lightyear and would start telling stories himself about Buzz Lightyear and about the surgeries Buzz Lightyear was having, as he himself was relating to surgeries. And Frank's idea is that having a story of some other character confronting something that you see as similar in certain respects to something that you're dealing with in your life creates a kind of bond that's a little bit like a friendship, in that the story makes suggestions about possibilities that you might consider as you're approaching your own situation. Not insisting that this is the way to see it, but giving you kind of imaginative room to think about it yourself and considering whether or not you want to pursue it in the same way as the person in the story does. And I think that that's a very important concept. I thought also that there are some other kinds of artworks beyond narratives that can have this impact as well. So, for example, I was very interested in art critic Laura Cummings' account of, in a sense, being overtaken by Las Meninas by Velázquez when she saw it after the death of her father, who is a painter. And it's not that the content of the painting was suggesting something particular about how she should approach the loss, but the very fact of Velázquez having painted these people that died centuries ago in such a vivid, alive way in this particular moment struck her as very powerful, as a way of thinking about the way we regard the dead. That she was regarding her father in a light of, in some sense, keeping his presence alive by remembering him and reflecting on him and recognizing his work. And that struck me as a kind of artwork, or a kind of companion artwork of another sort, that was beneficial to her throughout the process of grieving. And she makes this very clear in her book about Velázquez and the writing of, or the painting of various sorts that he did, and the story of a man who became obsessed with finding a lost Velázquez. So it's a fascinating book, but it struck me that that was a particular way of coping that involved an artwork too, that was a kind of friend in this context. I think that there might be other kinds of artworks too that enable one to just suddenly look at the whole situation in a different light and suggest a different way of looking at it that can be healing.
And one of the other things that you mentioned, which I personally found very useful, was this idea of that artworks can sort of demonstrate a kind of continuity with the past, that even amidst a life-changing series of events, that there's something about the continued existence of certain artworks that can be a symbol almost of continuity, and the fact that not everything has changed, even though it might feel that way. But at the same time, when revisiting the same artworks multiple times, we're not necessarily having the same experience with them. And so there's that variety of experience alongside the continuity, which I thought was a really nice pairing, the way that you talked about that. I wondered if you had anything else that you wanted to add on that subject.
Well, yeah, I think that the fact that the same artworks can be treasured over generations is something that makes us experience ourselves as part of an ongoing generation. And that can be either, sort of like major works in the tradition, like Velázquez's Las Meninas, or, something like a big band record that I still enjoy, that my father enjoyed. And I feel like there's still a kind of connection between us in enjoying the same music, even though there's a temporal gap between the times that we do it. And I think that that is also something that can be valuable even beyond grief, because a lot of times I don't think that we tend to think of ourselves as somehow ensconced in traditions that last generations, in part because we live in a world where novelty and the unprecedented nature of whatever we're facing gets emphasized so much. But the really valuable aspect of being part of a longer tradition in which generations are bound by ties of love and concern for each other and caring about similar things is something we don't appreciate enough.
Definitely. And I think that's where this kind of broader view of what counts as the aesthetic is really, really helpful, and really enriches our understanding of these things, because it's not just, as you say, it's not just the Velázquez or not even just recordings of music, but it's these sort of traditions and practices, maybe ways that we arrange our home or ways that we celebrate certain occasions and things that have been passed down, that we continue doing, are also very important aspects of not only this process but our understanding of what the aesthetic is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about was the role of music when it comes to grief and mourning. And I think a lot of people will probably be familiar from their own experiences, really, about some of the roles that music can play. I mean, music is often has an important role in our sort of funeral rituals. It can be a source of comfort, a way of maintaining connection with the person who's died. But there's some additional features of music that you draw out in this book. I'd really love you to talk about those a bit more.
Well, one of the things that I found quite interesting reading this in a discussion of music by a philosopher named Charles Nussbaum is that we often don't appreciate as much as we might how tactile the experience of music is. So he spends some time talking about the kind of haptic or effect of music, the way it connects with our sense of being tangibly connected to other things in the world. And I think that one of the comments that he makes is that in experiencing fine music, however we understand that, we experience something like loving touch. And I thought that that is probably one of the reasons why music that we think is suitable to us at any rate, can be so comforting in grief, because there is a kind of sense of the world as enveloping you in a kind of sound that you can appreciate, that it's the world doing something benevolent towards you. and it's in a context in which you might feel pretty estranged from things, feeling this kind of warmth emanating from the environment and enveloping you, I think is really very powerful. Another thing that I was thinking about in connection with music, and particularly I was focused on the way in which music is used in funeral rituals and other kinds of commemorations, is that in the context of grieving, the sense of being disconnected from other people, especially with respect to our impressions of time and, moving forward to meet the future, is completely distinct. That in the context of a ritual, there is a sharing of music where there is a kind of sequential movement of whatever the musical form is that you share with other people. And that involves an experience of temporal flow that isn't as off-putting during grief as something that seems to be, like, well, let's get involved in these projects and move along. And that's precisely what you don't want. But in this context, it's simply sharing the movement of time along with other people, probably in a fairly gentle way, that at least provides a respite from that sense of estrangement caused by being so temporally out of sorts, you might say, or at least out of step with other people. And in the context, usually their music is used in a way to support reflections of whatever sort people are having. Admittedly, sometimes there are songs and they have specific words, but I think often in ritual contexts, and even in the context of something like a funeral home or a visitation in connection with a funeral, background music allows everyone to deal with their own reflections of whatever sort they might be, but in a context where they're supporting each other in that activity. So the sense of collision between one person's worldview about the nature of death and the status of the dead doesn't, and that of another person gets mitigated by the sense that, we're all dealing with this as best we can, and we're here to support each other and share at least the experience of reflecting on it, if not the content of our reflections.
You have very kindly contributed an essay to our forthcoming print issue, and the focus of our next issue is suffering, quite broadly construed, what it means to live with suffering, and the different ways that philosophy might help us to do so. I wanted to ask you specifically about the role of philosophy here. So how does philosophy help us to understand the nature of grief, and how aesthetic practices and activities might help us on our journey of coming to terms with it?
It's interesting to me that philosophy doesn't discuss grief more. There are a number of people these days who are talking about the topic, but it hasn't tended to be such a focal topic in philosophy, I think for some of the reasons that we've already talked about, that it seems to be something that it can't be specified so precisely as a short-term emotional experience. So it's hard to analyze in emotional philosophy of emotion terms as they're usually set out. And it also doesn't seem to be something that admits of general description very easily. But I think philosophy in general can be helpful, whether it's directly talking about grief or not, because it does suggest taking a perspective on things, getting some distance from a kind of experience that you might be having. And in the context of grieving, particularly the fact that philosophy somehow aims to take a larger or somehow assimilate whatever it is that you're focused on into a larger context can be helpful for people in general. And also, I think one of the great things about philosophy is that if it's really addressing what happens in human life, it necessarily goes back and forth between paying attention to the specifics of an experience and relating it to something that is larger or reflective or connects up with meanings that are already in place or that one is developing. And I think that that's one of the reasons that philosophy can be so beneficial for people when dealing with loss. I don't think philosophy has often fully addressed the aesthetic side of this, which is why I wanted to write about it. But I think certainly there are many philosophical discussions of aesthetics, especially in contexts of everyday life and caring, that can be especially helpful in this connection.
Yeah, and one of the things you mention in the book is that philosophy sometimes has this problem with really addressing and taking seriously human vulnerability, and our interdependence. And so I think that's something that your book does very well, is really really emphasize the ways that we do end up coming together and supporting each other in these sorts of difficult circumstances, and the different methods that we might use, the different aesthetic practices to try and do that. It is now time, I think, for us to turn to some audience questions. So let's have a look at some of the questions that we've received. Okay, so our first question here is from Michael. We are shifting between a religious and secular view of death. Is a funeral meant to be a commemoration of someone's life or a public mourning for their death? Does this add to our individualistic attitudes so that grieving becomes more private and isolating than it need be?
Well, I think funerals, generally speaking, are not entirely isolating in that they are designed to bring a larger social group beyond, just the individual or the immediate family together. I've certainly encountered differences of opinion about whether the focus should be on mourning a person or celebrating their life. And I think actually both of them are usually in view, and it's more a question of how one feels the balance what should be more heavily weighted. But I think usually in funerals, there's an acknowledgement of the person, something about the person's life, probably some of the personal characteristics of the person that one admires. And I think that often that can be the focus of what the world has lost. At the same time, I think that what actually heals is feeling some continued connection with the person and the way in which the person has connected with one's own life. And so the appreciation of that partly makes the mourning more acute because, again, the fact that one can't continue interacting in the same way with someone who has now died becomes evident. But also, I think it points forward toward ways in which the influence of the person on one's life will continue to be a part of one's life. I guess that can be viewed as a celebration. The fact that I take the point that traditionally, the idea of mourning the person was more in view, and that when people describe rituals as celebrating the person's life, that can be a little bit aggressively forcing people to attend to what a great person the person was and not to the sadness of the loss in a way that doesn't really address the sadness of the loss. But I don't think that even such funerals are done in a completely private, isolated way. And I suspect that even in very secular funerals that resist traditional religious formats for continuing with a tradition, that still something is in view that emphasizes the tradition and are continuing, like doing something that is proper or doing right by the person, is still designed to situate the whole context of the loss and our relationship to it in a larger social context. So I'm not as worried about them, perhaps, as maybe I should be.
Thank you. Okay, next question from Lario. Are there parallels with the way one deals with death-related grief and non-death related grief?
I think that's really an important question. I think there are, but I think that the particular thing one is grieving in connection with is going to make a big difference in some of these matters. In some ways, the case of grief over the loss of someone to death is maybe more straightforward and therefore easier to analyze than some other kinds of grief. For example, grief over the loss of a job or a set of circumstances that one has experienced, grief over the loss of health. There are going to be different kinds of continuities with life as it's been lived up to that point, but probably shocking repercussions in terms of ways that the new situation makes continuing certain features of your life at least undergo radical change, if not, complete replacement. I still think that aesthetic activities can be helpful. I mean, some of them may be explicitly mourning directed, but also kind of mindfully attending to aspects of the loss and doing something external that helps to put the loss in a context, I think, can help provide meaning in these circumstances. But yeah, certainly there are a lot of important things to say about the parallels and differences between different kinds of losses.
Thank you. Okay, next question is from Clara. If humans all held the same belief about death and the afterlife, do you think the way we experience or respond to grief would change?
Perhaps in some respects, but I think on balance, probably not. Even if people adhere to the same beliefs about an afterlife or lack of an afterlife, exactly what they have in mind, I think, can vary quite a lot. I one of the aspects of people agreeing about certain statements that can be made about the dead and their relationship to us is that they're very broad and make it appear that people who assert the same belief are actually on the same page. In some ways, I think, say one is in a community where everyone believes in an afterlife, that may give people a kind of shared vocabulary for talking about what's happening. But I think that the loss within a person's own life in terms of this world is going to be still alienating, and the apparent agreement of ways of talking about it might in fact disguise that. So I'm not sure that it always is helpful when people think they agree about the nature of death and the status of the dead, which is not to say that I think that that might not be a great help in some contexts when dealing with other people, but I think it might seem a greater help than in practice it is.
Thank you. Okay, next question is from Let, who wants to ask about what happens when you just can't appreciate the aesthetic after grief. So instances wherein the aesthetic itself becomes a source of deep grief, either because it reminds you of the lost loved one, maybe due to the shared love you both had for a particular aesthetic practice or activity or artwork, or because you just can't get yourself to enjoy things anymore at all because of your grief.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It kind of depends on the specific context in which you feel kind of alienated from the aesthetic in general. And I suspect that for most people, at some stage, things change so that certain kinds of aesthetic appreciation can enter in again. But I agree, especially immediately after loss, it's very hard to have any enthusiasm for anything, let alone regard a particular aesthetic thing that was bonding in a completely happy light. I remember one time when a mentor of mine had died, and had died violently, and I was having a very difficult time of it. And at a certain stage, I stopped for lunch and took a bite of an apple, and I realized I tasted it for the first time in a long time. And that was, of course, a bittersweet moment because in some ways I wanted to linger in just being sad, but my immediate reaction was to think I was very sad that my mentor could no longer enjoy the taste of an apple. So I kind of combined the sadness with appreciating something in the world. And one thing that I think is valuable about the aesthetic is it takes all kinds of forms. The mixed feelings one can have about the personal effects of the deceased, I think, show that it often isn't just sadness. Certainly, seeing my late husband's shoes where he had left them before he died struck me as a terribly sad thing, but that there was a kind of immediate sense of his presence and his connection with the place gave it a kind of counterbalanced it. I think that there may be a case where someone, is so apathetic about the things of this world that aesthetics on any level can't be enjoyed. I think it's fortunate that for most people that period passes, and this kind of two-way aspect of regarding something so that they both bring up the sadness but also bring up the connection can sometimes be a way of moving toward greater adjustment in a very sad set of circumstances.
Yeah, and that reinforces again, I think, this central idea that grief is a dynamic and complex process, So there'll be different responses to different aesthetic practices at different points in that process, and that isn't going to be uniform. And so it's worth thinking about that, and perhaps these more sort of rigid ideas of moving through the sort of phases of grief, they just don't, it doesn't quite map onto what the actual experience itself can be like. I think we've got time for one final question. So I'm going to go to Richard's question. And Richard asks, are aesthetic activities such as writing about loss healing because you move towards the source of pain? Namely, for example, the memory of a love once had instead of avoiding it?
I think that can often be the case. I found it healing to write about my husband's death, but also write this book that obliquely touches on it, but in some ways has to do with processes that I found helpful. Yes, I think often the writing itself helps one to sort out some of one's thoughts and feelings about what's happened, and can be a mode of processing on its own. I think a lot of aesthetic activities that are geared to emotional expression, I think, can help sort out some of the feelings that we have, and at least put them in a context where the possibility of ordering things in a way that you can get a handle on it is at least a start toward greater adjustment to the situation. So yeah, I think it's helpful to write. I like writing, obviously, but yeah, I think there are other ways that this could happen as well.
Super. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're now out of time. So thank you once again for joining us this evening, Kathleen, and giving us the opportunity to talk about your book. It's been marvellous. So thank you very much. And for those of you in the audience who would like to read some of Kathleen's work, obviously buy her book. It's excellent. But she also has an essay in the upcoming print issue, which should be coming out towards the end of the year,